406 enemy warships, 31 human. The staff plan said retreat, and Admiral Iris van threw it in the recycler. She was 62 years old, and she had spent 40 of those years in the fleet, and she was the only human admiral the Ascendancy had never beaten. They knew it too. Their war college had a name for her that translated, roughly, as the Gray Snare. The Ascendancy Armada had entered the outer system 9 days earlier. Its destination was not in question. Earth. Its route was not in question either, and that was the single card humanity held. To reach the inner worlds in this century, the Armada had to pass through the Ceres Gap, a corridor of navigable space threading the asteroid belt's densest shoals, 400,000 kilometers long and at its narrowest, barely 90 wide. A fleet in the gap could not spread its wings. 400 ships would have to come through as a column, like a river forced through a canyon. Van stood at the strategic display aboard her flagship, the Temeraire, and laid out for her captains the battle she had spent 9 days designing. 24 ships, the heart of the fleet, would go dark and cold, powered down among the shoals, invisible, positioned along the canyon's walls like held breath. 7 ships, the oldest and loudest, would stand in the enemy's path as a visible, desperate, doomed rearguard. The trap was as simple as a snare ever is. And like every snare, it had one problem: bait. The Ascendancy commander was careful, methodical, and famous for smelling traps. He would never commit 400 ships into a canyon to chase 7 old cruisers. He would commit them to catch her. On the wall of Van's day cabin hung a print, sun-faded, of an old Earth painting. A sailing warship, ghost, pale, and glorious, towed to her breaking yard by a small dark tug. The Fighting Temeraire. Her flag captain had asked her once why she kept a picture of a ship being taken apart. "Because nobody paints the tug," she had said. She looked at it now for a long moment. Then she signed the order placing her own flagship and her own flag and her own famous name in the center of the killing ground. The fleet took position over 3 days, and the hardest part was not the hiding. It was the arguing. The hiding was merely brutal. 24 warships shut down everything that made them alive. Reactors banked to embers. Crews in thermal suits breathing scrubbed air in the cold and the dark, ships lashed to asteroids with cargo cable, wearing radar blankets like shrouds. They would wait like that, blind and freezing, for as long as the battle took to arrive. Once they went dark, no signal could reach them without betraying everything. The plan was the plan. There would be no changing it. The arguing came aboard the Temeraire, and it came from the one man entitled to make it. Her flag captain, who had served her for 11 years, read the full plan in silence twice. "You've made us the bait," he said. "I've made me the bait," Van said. "The Ascendancy commander has studied me for 20 years. He has fought my squadrons 4 times and lost 4 times, and it has made him careful everywhere except one place. Me. I am the trophy that retires him a legend. If my flag sits in that canyon looking cornered, he will not send a vanguard to test it. He will bring everything, because anything less risks me slipping away again." The flag captain looked at the display, at the 7-ship screen and the little blue icon of the Temeraire at its center, and did the arithmetic every officer aboard would eventually do. "For the trap to work, the bait has to hold the canyon's center," he said, "under the guns of the whole Armada. There's no line of retreat on this map, Admiral." "There is," Van said. "It's just very expensive." She gave the order that evening that the crews remembered afterward more clearly than the battle itself. The Temeraire's company was cut to combat minimum. Every rating whose station could be automated or abandoned went off the ship to the hidden squadrons, 800 people reassigned by name, over the protest of nearly all of them. What remained aboard the flagship was 200 volunteers and 1 admiral. On the 4th morning, the leading edge of the Armada entered the Ceres Gap. 406 ships, in a column 200,000 kilometers long, came down the canyon like weather. And the trap held its breath. The battle opened at range, and for 6 hours it was exactly the battle the enemy expected to fight. That was its entire purpose. The human screen, 7 old cruisers, and the Temeraire met the Ascendancy vanguard at the gap's midpoint and began a fighting retreat so convincing it deserved an award for theater. They fired long. They maneuvered raggedly, like tired crews. They fell back in stages that looked improvised and were rehearsed to the second. losing ground at precisely the rate that would draw the column deeper. It was, Van would say later, the hardest thing she ever asked of gun crews. Losing convincingly without dying is the most difficult maneuver in the book. And it was not free. The stakes of the performance were paid in steel. The cruiser Halberd took a spinal hit in the 4th hour and had to make her failure real, falling out of line, burning. 90 of her crew came off in pods. The rest brought her home to the screen on manual helm, and her survival was so narrow that it improved the performance, because no one watching could believe it was permitted on purpose. Van stood her bridge through all of it in the eye of her own deception. The Temeraire fought loudly, her flag transmitting, her batteries theatrical. Everything about her said cornered animal, said last stand, said come and take her. 6 hours in, the enemy vanguard commander did the smart thing. He halted the advance. The column stopped 100,000 kilometers into the canyon. Probes swarmed out toward the shoals. On the Temeraire's flag bridge, the plot filled with drone tracks crawling toward the walls where 24 frozen ships lay holding their breath, and the tactical officer's knuckles went white on the rail. The Ascendancy commander's caution had arrived on schedule. He smelled it. Careful as ever, he was going to sweep the shoals before committing, and the sweep would find the fleet, and the trap would become a massacre in reverse. Van watched the drones crawl for 1 full minute. Then she said almost to herself, "He needs a better reason to be reckless. Very well, signals strike my ensign." The bridge turned as one, and run up the signal for general distress. No human flagship had broadcast general distress in the open since the fleet's founding. It was the one signal that could not be faked, because faking it was the Navy's deepest taboo. Every officer in both fleets knew that. Which was exactly why it worked. The Temeraire's transmission painted the picture the enemy commander already wanted to believe. Her reactor signature stuttered, then collapsed to emergency levels, a ship suddenly bleeding to death. Her weapons fell silent, battery by battery. Escape pods, empty ones, jettisoned from her ventral bays in ragged clusters. And through it all, her distress beacon hammered in the clear, carrying her name and her flag code, the gray snare, crippled, drifting, alone in a canyon with her broken little squadron scattering. Every part of it was theater. The reactor stutter was Dana-fine engineering by volunteers sweating over deliberately mistuned coolant loops. The pods were ballast. The scattering squadron was 7 ships running to hiding places surveyed weeks before. Aboard the Ascendancy flagship, 200,000 kilometers up the column, the enemy commander faced the choice Van had built for him. His probes needed 9 more hours to sweep the shoals properly. His enemy of 20 years lay dying in front of him now. 9 hours from now, she might be repaired, or rescued, or, unbearable thought gone, escaped a 5th time to reappear in some future battle with that patient gray stare. History records his order verbatim, recovered later from his own logs. All divisions, general advance. The snare is sprung and empty. I will have her flag on my wall by tonight. 406 ships lit their drives and poured down the canyon at attack speed. Column compressing, formation tightening as the walls narrowed. Every captain racing every other captain for the honor of the kill. On the Temeraire's darkened bridge, Van watched the tide come and permitted herself, by testimony of everyone present, exactly one small smile. "Gentlemen," she said, "they've accepted our invitation. Signal nothing. The walls know their hour." The Armada's leading divisions passed the first hidden squadron at 19:14 fleet time. At 19:15, the series gap turned into the largest ambush in the history of war. The walls came alive in sequence, stern of the column first, and that detail was the whole battle. Van had arranged her hidden squadrons not to attack the enemy's face, but to close his exits. The rearmost divisions of the Ascendancy column, still entering the gap, met 8 human ships rising off the shoals behind them, engines flaring out of nothing, torpedo salvos already running. At the same moment, mass driver batteries emplaced on 3 of the largest asteroids, the fleet engineer's quiet masterpiece, opened fire. They did not shoot at ships. They shot at the shoals above the canyon's mouth and started the landslides. Millions of tons of rock, nudged by physics and patience, began to close the gap's rear entrance like a slow, terrible door. The column's rear tried to turn in a corridor with no room for turning. The middle divisions, packed at attack speed, plowed into their own braking chaos. And then the flanking squadrons lit. 16 more human ships at point-blank ambush range along both walls, pouring fire into the columns' compressed flanks, where no ship could maneuver and every miss hit something anyway. For 20 minutes, the series gap was fire from wall to wall. But 400 ships is 400 ships. The Ascendancy commander was reckless, not incompetent, and his answer was fast and correct. If the rear was closing, he would go forward, through the bait, out the canyon's far mouth, and take his armada into open space where numbers ruled. His lead divisions, 80 strong, reformed with fearsome discipline and accelerated straight down the throat of the gap. Straight at the drifting, dying Temeraire. Which was the plan? The far exit's landslide batteries needed 40 more minutes to close the door. Something had to hold 80 warships in the canyon's neck for 40 minutes. The volunteers had known. Van had told them plainly on the first day, the bait fights twice. The Temeraire's reactor came off its fake deathbed in 90 seconds, every mistuned loop swinging true, and the old Flagship rose in the enemy's path with all batteries live and her ensign, run up fresh, burning in her lights. Her beacon changed message, no longer distress. It broadcast one line in the clear on every band. The exit is closed. Ask your museums who I am. The stand of the Temeraire lasted 37 minutes, and the fleet has counted every one of them every year since. She was one ship against 80, and she had 3 advantages. The canyon's neck was 90 kilometers wide, so the 80 could only come at her a handful at a time. Her crew was 200 volunteers who had rehearsed this exact ground for weeks, and she did not need to win. She needed only to remain, an obstacle of fire and armor wedged in the door for 40 minutes. She fought like a fortress. Van's gunnery plan spent the first 10 minutes killing helms, not hulls, wrecking the lead ship's steering so their tonnage became her wall, corpses and cripples piling into the neck as barricade. The enemy pushed wrecks aside and came on. She mined her own drift lanes with her remaining pods, real ones now. They came on. Her armor, the oldest and thickest in the human fleet, shed hits that would have opened any other ship, and her damage parties fought fires in 6 compartments while her batteries never once fell silent. But arithmetic is patient. By the 20th minute she had lost her forward turrets. By the 30th she was burning down half her length, her ensign lit now by her own fires, and the enemy commander himself had entered the neck, his flagship's guns joining the storm, his signals demanding her surrender with something close to pleading in the phrasing. He had wanted a trophy, not this. Her reply is in both fleets' textbooks. She ceased fire for 8 seconds, precisely long enough to transmit, then resumed with everything left. The Temeraire does not strike. She is already in a painting. Come and earn yours. At minute 37, the far mouth's landslides met in the middle. The door was shut. 406 Ascendancy warships were sealed in a canyon with 30 human ships and their own multiplying wreckage. Van had one order left to give, and every account agrees her voice was steady. All hands, she said, abandon ship, and thank you. It has been the honor of the age. What followed the Temeraire's evacuation was not a battle. It was a negotiation conducted in the grammar of gunfire, and Van conducted it from a life pod. That detail is not legend, it is logged. The Admiral's pod, per plan, carried a full flag communications suite, and she commanded the closing hour of the engagement from amidst the drifting survivors of her own flagship, a point her enemies later confirmed had paralyzed their targeting doctrine entirely. No Ascendancy captain would fire on life pods. She had counted on that too. She had counted on everything. The Armada's position was mathematically hopeless and psychologically unbearable. Sealed in, compressed, flanked, their supreme commander's flagship trapped in a wreck-choked neck beside the burning hulk of the ship that had baited them. The hidden squadrons did not press for slaughter. On Van's explicit order, they pressed for stillness, killing engines and weapons, hurting, until the column could neither fight nor flee nor even properly form. Then she opened a channel to her opposite number, and the exchange that ended the invasion of Earth took 4 sentences. Commander, your fleet is in my snare and your government is far away. I am prepared to accept the surrender of your ships, with honors, with your crew's safety under my personal flag. Or we can spend the evening making our museums longer. The pause on the channel lasted. Witnesses swear 3 full minutes. Then the reply, "You never lose, gray snare. It is intolerable. Where is the rest of your fleet?" We counted 31. "You've met all of it," Van said. Another pause longer. And the Ascendancy commander, 406 warships at his back, sealed in a stone corridor by an old woman in a life pod, began, unmistakably, audibly, to laugh. It went on for some time. His own bridge recording preserves it, and preserves what he said when he finished, which the translators render. The museum's it is, then, ours displaying yours. His flag came down at 22:41 fleet time. The armadas followed division by division through the night. The invasion of Earth ended in the Ceres gap, 9 light minutes from the nearest human home, at a cost of 9 human ships and 1 flagship that everyone aboard had already agreed to spend. The morning after is the part historians linger on, because it is the part that decided the next century. Dawn, such as it is in the belt, found 30,000 Ascendancy prisoners in a sealed canyon, 400 surrendered warships, and a victorious fleet of 30, outnumbered 13-1 by the people it had just captured. Standing doctrine on both sides had no page for it. 1 nervous hour could have undone everything. Van, recovered from her pod, wearing a borrowed jacket because her own had gone down burning with her ship, issued the general order that the Ascendancy still teaches beside her battle plan. It contained no security protocols. It read, in its entirety, "They are sailors far from home whose Admiral spent them honestly and surrendered them honorably. Feed them from our own stores first. The war is over if we say it correctly." Her captain said it correctly. Human supply shuttles moved through the captive fleet all day, provisioning the ships that had come to burn Earth. The Ascendancy crews, braced for humiliation, received rations, medical teams, and channel access to send messages home. Their commander toured the human fleet at Van's invitation and was piped aboard each ship with full honors, 30 times, which his logs describe with a bewilderment that shades, entry by entry, into something else. The armistice was drafted within the month in the gap itself, aboard a repair tender anchored beside the Temeraire's hulk. The Ascendancy delegation asked for that venue. Their commander insisted on signing, he said, where he could see the price of the lesson through a viewport. The treaty held, it holds still. The Ascendancy, it turned out, was a polity that respected exactly one credential, victory, and having awarded it to humanity in full, became with disorienting speed a scrupulous, then cordial, then genuinely warm neighbor. Their cadets study the gap. Their war college renamed its highest honor for tactical audacity. They call it the tug. Van, when she heard, laughed until she had to sit down and never told them why. 9 human ships were lost in the Ceres gap, with 612 of their people. The fleet reads their names each year, at the gap, before anything else is said. The Temeraire's 200 volunteers came through with 19 dead, every one of them in the final stand at the neck. Their names are read last, and the reading ends, by tradition Van began, not with a prayer but with a bearing and a speed. The course the last convoy never had to flee on. Unused kept. Iris Van refused the Grand Fleet Command, the Ministry, and the presidency of 2 colonies in that order, and took the post everyone should have predicted, Commandant of the War College. She taught for 11 years. Her course was oversubscribed by a factor of 40 every year, and it was not a course about the Ceres gap. She refused to teach the gap as victory. She taught it as a bill itemized. Her opening lecture never changed, and generations of officers can recite it. She would stand at the lectern, no slides, no display, and hold up one hand, fingers spread. Every plan worth making costs 5 things, she would say. Fuel, steel, time, blood, and one thing you love. The first 4 any competent staff can budget. The 5th is the Admiral's own bill, and it cannot be delegated. And if you have not identified before the battle the thing you love that the plan will spend, then you have not finished planning. You have only finished hoping. A cadet would always ask, because a cadet always asks, what she had loved. The old woman would look every time at the back wall of the hall where the college had hung over her sustained objection, the sun-faded print from her day cabin, the pale warship, the small dark tug. I loved being the ship, she would say. 40 years I was the ship. The plan needed me to be the tug. She never once called the Temeraire's loss a sacrifice. Sacrifice, she said, was spending someone else's beloved thing. There was a different word for spending your own, and the word was price, and the difference between the two words, she told every graduating class, was the entire moral content of command. She attended the reading at the Gap every year. She stood at the viewport of the repair tender before the names, beside captains she had trained and captains she had captured, several of whom crossed half the galaxy annually to stand there with her. And every year after the last name and the kept course, the old enemy commander, Gray himself now, would ask her the same question as the lights came up, their private ritual, his accent wrapping carefully around the human words. "Where is the rest of your fleet, Gray Snare?" And every year she gave the same answer, tilting her head toward the assembled officers of two navies, the living and the taught. "You're standing in it." The Temeraire was never scrapped, which everyone agrees is the only possible ending, and never restored, which takes longer to understand. She lies where she fought in the neck of the Ceres Gap, made fast to the canyon wall by the same engineers who once aimed landslides. Her burned deck sealed. Her ensign, the real one, the one that flew through the final 37 minutes, preserved under crystal on her quarterdeck. The wreckage of the battle was cleared from the corridor decades ago. She was left, at the request, remarkably, of both fleets. The Ascendancy asked first. Their petition, preserved in the treaty annexes, argued that their people had earned the right to remember the lesson in its true shape, and that a repaired Temeraire would be a monument to a battle, but a burned one was a monument to a choice. Every ship of both navies that transits the Gap slows as it passes her, not by regulation, by custom older than half the crews observing it. Freighters do it, warships do it. Ascendancy squadrons on joint exercise do it with particular ceremony, running their batteries to full elevation as they pass, saluting sky. Iris Van's ashes went to the Gap at the end, carried by the last living volunteer of the Flagship's final stand. There is no monument to her there. She forbade it in writing, with the acid clarity she reserved for paperwork she truly meant, and the fleet which had disobeyed her never did not start then. But the passage instruction for the Ceres Gap, in the navigation database every human and Ascendancy ship carries, was amended the year she died, by an author the registry lists only as fleet. It is the sole poetic line in 40,000 pages of procedure, and no captain of either species has ever filed a correction. It reads, "Transiting vessels will reduce speed through the neck. You are passing the Temeraire and the price of the peace you are enjoying. Nobody paints the tug. Mind her wake. If this story stayed with you, subscribe. A new one leaves Earth every day."